Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Zack Kopplin, who's an investigator for the Government Accountability Project and a columnist for The Guardian, whose investigations have included opposing science denial legislation, revealing police and judicial misconduct, and uncovering corruption in Afghanistan. Welcome to Background Briefing, Zack Kopplin.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, thanks for joining us. And it's sort of not getting a lot of attention that President Biden on Friday has decided to clear the path to give $3.5 billion of frozen Afghanistan central bank funds deposited in the New York Federal Reserve, half of it to the victims of 9/11 and the other half put into a trust to help the humanitarian problem in Afghanistan, or the humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan, and somehow get help to the Afghan people as opposed to give the money to the Taliban. I'm not sure how they're going to accomplish that, but we can talk about it. But in general, there was so much attention on Afghanistan when the U.S. pulled out, so much criticism of Biden from both the press and from the Republicans. But the feeling I have now is that, do you think Americans care about Afghanistan?
So in my personal opinion, to answer that one, I don't think Americans have cared about Afghanistan in a very long time. And this latest decision by Biden is more evidence of that. To me, and again, in my opinion, it's absolutely horrifying and arguably a war crime.
To basically punish the Afghan people? I mean, in other words,
yeah.
Your feeling is that taking this money is some sort of theft, do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, others have suggested that. How would you describe it?
So to think about this money, there's two pieces, right? This money comes from the Afghan central bank. And so it doesn't belong to the Taliban. It belongs to the Afghan people. And this includes the life savings of a lot of Afghan citizens that are frozen in New York. Biden is taking this money from people who had nothing to do with 9/11, who many of them weren't even alive when 9/11 happened. He's taking money directly from them and using it to pay the victims. And again, if we want to give $3.5 billion to the victims of 9/11 right now, just do it. Take the money from the U.S. government and pay it. Don't steal the money from starving people in a country that we've occupied for 20 years, that we've bombed, that we've enabled corruption. I mean, again, what is happening in Afghanistan right now lies firmly on President Biden, Trump, Obama, and Bush. I mean, that is who is responsible for this current situation, and taking their life savings, taking their bank's financial liquidity away and causing a financial crisis, and using it to, again, pay Americans who were, again, victims, but had nothing to do, the people who were paying for this had nothing to do with the people who victimized these Americans, and B, to aid organizations who are going to, again, pay off lawyers in New York, we're going to pay military contractors, will pay bribes to the Taliban with this money. I mean, this money belongs to the Afghan people, including their life savings, and they won't see it. And that, to me, it's looting. That's not legal under international law, in my opinion.
But how do you get money to the Afghan people?
So this is a very hard policy question, and I'm certainly not going to pretend to be the expert on how do you do this. Again, this is my personal opinion, is we should accept the consequences of the decisions we've made. I don't like the Taliban. I think they are awful. I think they're human rights abusers. But we gave up, between the U.S. military occupation and the Ghani administration that we were propping up, we gave them Kabul. We made our choice. We shouldn't starve the people of Afghanistan in retaliation. And so I think we should just, again, let the banks have their money back. Let the people have their life savings back. And again, because you can say, oh, no, we can't give it back to the Taliban because they're human rights abusers. But why didn't President Biden evacuate anyone from Afghanistan who wanted it? Why are Afghans stuck in refugee camps in the UAE and Iran? Why aren't we taking more Afghan refugees? Why aren't we helping anyone get out of the country, right? So if we're going to hold up our hand and say, oh, no, we can't give this money to an evil regime, but anything meaningful that we could have actually done to help people suffering in Afghanistan, we said, oh, no, that's too politically difficult. Oh, no, the Republicans won't like that. Oh, no, people don't like refugees, so we can't actually help them despite the fact that we occupied their country. It just rings hollow. And the answer to me, again, it's certainly not looting this money and giving it to Americans. That just is horrifying.
But since Pakistan always wanted this outcome and continued to stab the US in the back in terms of its efforts and money, and after all, the US did spend a ton of money on the Afghan military, and they decided not to fight. So that may contribute to America's lack of interest in the country. If they can't even defend their own country, why? I mean, I'm not condoning the callousness of this decision.
I would push back on that, which is so basically part of it is the numbers you hear about, for example, the Afghan military. Arguably, by the time that Kabul fell, the Taliban had larger numbers and better equipped soldiers. And in large part, that was the numbers, for example, that President Biden, when President Biden gave a press conference after the Taliban took over, where he essentially blamed the Afghan military for failure and said they had 300,000 soldiers. The U.S. government knew that was not true. When Biden gave that speech, West Point, for example, put out a report that said that the Afghan army actually had a force that was probably less than 100,000 soldiers. So the president is contradicted by American government reports. So that's one issue. If they can't, they were doing the best they could to defend their country. Although, again, with the caveat that many of these people are warlords, many of these people are human rights abusers themselves. It wasn't a pretty picture on either side, including the forces we were propping up. But I would say that, again, we want to talk about, we've done enough for Afghanistan. Like, when we break that down, what did we actually do for Afghanistan? That the trillions of dollars that we spent on the war, most Afghans didn't see that money. That money went in Afghanistan to oligarchs and political figures and warlords, and went to Lockheed Martin in America, to the military contractor SOS International that I talked about last time I was on this program, that was involved in a corruption scheme with the American-backed Afghan president. I mean, that's who saw this money. And so a lot of it, again, American planes, American bullets, that's where that money went. And it's not that we've invested so much in Afghanistan. We just invested a lot in war. And the people who lost the most were the civilians getting killed out in rural Afghanistan.
So if the Taliban were better armed and equipped than the Afghan forces, most of that support came from Pakistan. Does Pakistan have any responsibility to deal with the consequences of this war, since this is the outcome that they wanted? There are 23 million Afghans facing starvation. Now, obviously, the U.S. position is insupportable, and this $3.5 billion trust fund that Biden's talking about setting up to get humanitarian aid to them, nobody quite knows how that's going to be accomplished and how you do get humanitarian aid to the people of Afghanistan. But should Pakistan be stepping up to the plate?
So this is this for me, again, as a U.S. citizen and not a citizen of Pakistan, it's hard for me to dictate essentially moral responsibility. If I were a Pakistani citizen, I would probably be horrified at Pakistan's role in the conflict and my own kind of moral culpability in that, but I'm not. So it is harder for me to speak on those grounds. But I can say there aren't really any good actors here. No one comes out of this smelling good. And again, the people who are suffering are just like millions of civilians. But and I can again, as I'm a citizen of the U.S., I do feel a large amount of moral responsibility for our role in this conflict and what we've done wrong.
So, Zach, who is helping the 23 million Afghans facing starvation?
I am probably not the right person to ask this because I'm not. I don't actually work in the aid field. I imagine aid groups, but from what I understand, basically my expertise is more in corruption, and I can tell you more of how we got into the situation than how it's fixed. But there are certainly aid groups that are trying to help. It just from my understanding, things are going very badly in general.
So in terms then of the 9/11 relatives of victims getting half of the frozen funds, 3.5 billion, which is a considerable amount of money, it's not unanimous from what I understand. Well, what happened apparently was in September, a group of 150 relatives of September 11th victims won a default judgment after suing targets like Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and this is a case called Havlish. And then they went and served a writ, did they not, on the Federal Reserve of New York to seize the money. And where does that stand now? So Biden is sort of siding with that. Is that the mechanism here?
The fundamental problem, whatever U.S. courts say, there's a fundamental problem with seizing this money because it's not the Taliban's money. Like if I don't know, like let's just do a hypothetical example, right? Let's say I'm related to, like, let's take the January 6th coup plotters, right? Let's say I'm a relative of one of the people who died there, and I say, you know what? I want to blame America fostered these people, and so I want to take money out of bank accounts of random other Americans to pay for it. That's essentially the same logic that's being used here. Like you can't, like, you're just taking someone random's life savings to pay victims of a crime that they had nothing to do with. It's what you call that is collective punishment, and that's not a legal thing to do.
Well, as I say, amongst the 9/11 families of the victims, there's some groups that don't agree with what's happening, and that's the September 11th Families for a Peaceful Tomorrow. What do you know about that organization? What kind of percentage would that represent? Because I imagine most of the families of victims would be happy to receive, what's going to be a lot of money, isn't it?
I honestly can't speak to that because that's way outside my expertise. I
Right.
actually know much of the breakdown of how 9/11 victims feel about this.
Right.
I mean, you can speculate like that and it wouldn't shock me, but I don't know.
Right. But there is this group called September 11th Families for a Peaceful Tomorrow that apparently are not agreeing with this decision on the part of the Biden administration.
I do applaud them for that. I think that's an excellent and bold step from them.
Right. So what do you think then can be done in terms of getting the American people to understand their moral responsibility to what's happening in Afghanistan? And because you're one of the few voices that are pointing out that this is completely unjust and, in fact, borders on criminality. So what can be done here? Do you feel like you have any advocates on Capitol Hill?
It's government choices, right? Like we made choices about how many refugees we would take, right? That was a policy choice. We could take more refugees. If we open the doors to refugees, there will be people who want to come. If we make the process easier, if we make it more friendly, if we bring people out of these refugee camps, if we help smuggle people out of Afghanistan, there are people who would like to come relocate to the United States. There are people who are hiding from the Taliban right now for fear of being killed who would like to come to the United States. We could help them. And that to me, it's not as much a civilian, and we can help them without going to war. Like this isn't saying go to war, reinvade Afghanistan. This is saying help people get out, use the resources of the U.S. government to help that. And that I think is a choice that the government is currently not making. And unfortunately, again, I don't think the American people have much demand for that. I think, unfortunately, and it depresses me, there's very many people who live here who would say, we don't want anyone. We don't want to help at all. And the only way you change people's minds, for example, is, again, someone's going to feel much more kind about an Afghan refugee, maybe if they live next to one, if that's their neighbor, they've made friends with them, that they realize they're kind people, they're people just like them. And we're never going to have that kind of change unless we actually accept the refugees. So that I think it just has to come from the government first. And right now, it's not.
Well, what is coming from the government is what we're talking about, this decision to take the $7 billion in Afghan funds in the Federal Reserve banks in New York and give half to the families of victims of 9/11 and half into some kind of trust fund that's supposed to get humanitarian aid to the Afghan people who are starving. 23 million people are facing starvation in this winter. But surely this decision will cripple the country's financial system. People won't be able to get money out of the banks, and that would compound the starvation situation. You'll have not only a starvation crisis, but you'll have a financial crisis.
Yeah, it will lead to death. Also, there's something I want to also point out here that's really important to think about, and just the whole justification for this, right? Which is, and this is where I can actually speak to what I really know, and also to link to the point we made earlier. So you asked, like, how is the Taliban better equipped than the Afghan military? In large part because, let's say you were an Afghan commander or you were an American commander in Afghanistan, and you had troops at a base, right? And you needed these troops. They need ammo, they need MREs, they need water, they need gasoline, they need an internet router, they need TVs, maybe. All these things you have to truck across the highways, right? And the thing is, you're trucking through territories controlled by Taliban, ISIS, Khorasan province militia commanders. And the way to get your equipment through is you pay a bribe. And that is actually in large part how the Taliban or different groups within it were supporting themselves. It's the same story I can tell you about in Iraq, for example, that the U.S. was actively funding the people they were fighting through logistics contracts. And so, again, to bring this back to the point about the money, now that same principle will apply here. If you, separating from the money that we're giving to the victims of 9/11, you have that $3.5 billion that's supposedly going back to Afghanistan. And they're saying, well, we can't, we're taking this money because the Taliban, we can't give it to the Taliban. How do you think these aid groups, if in theory, are going to actually do work in Afghanistan? They're going to pay bribes to the Taliban. If they're working outside of Taliban territory, they're going to pay bribes to ISIS or to a local militia commander, whether that was U.S. government aligned, Pakistan aligned, Iran aligned, like Russia aligned. The people who are bad actors will be getting part of this money. That's how it's worked. That's how it's going to work. And so this whole thing of, we can't give the Taliban this money. Where do we think it's going to go with this anyway? It will just be done under the table, illicitly, in violation of international law, instead of awkwardly in a way that makes us embarrassed and looks bad because we lost a war. And I think that's just, again, I think doing illegal things that worsen situations because it's politically expedient is a mistake, versus just taking our medicine, which really sucks. And so that's my kind of opinion on that too.
Well, Zack Kopplin, I thank you so much for coming on today and giving us a bit of a wake-up call and pricking our conscience about what's happening in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on. I think it's, again, this is kind of, I'm speaking from my own personal experience just researching corruption in Afghanistan, but I think this is all very important to kind of see this clearly and see the harm that we're causing.
Well, thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Zack Kopplin, an investigator for the Government Accountability Project and a columnist for The Guardian, whose investigations have included opposing science denial legislation, revealing police and judicial misconduct, and uncovering corruption in